The internet is inarguably one of the most groundbreaking inventions humanity has ever made, and it's difficult to think of even one aspect of life that hasn't been affected by its creation. In many ways, the internet is absolutely fantastic. We have virtually unlimited amounts of knowledge at our fingertips, can communicate with people from around the world, and of course, best of all, there's me. But in many other ways, the internet has had a profoundly negative effect on the collective human psyche. With the popularity contests of social media, the passive dehumanization of faceless text-based communications, and of course, the raw, unfettered degeneracy that is aghast around every corner. Indeed, the internet is truly the definition of a mixed bag. It is, in many ways, a blessing, and in many ways, a curse. But the internet as we know it today is not how it always has been. Oh no. On the contrary, the internet has undergone three clearly observable errors that, depending on how long you've been around, you will either remember or not be aware of at all. The first error lasted roughly 1.5 decades, from 1990 to 2005, and has become colloquially known as the Wild West era. This is because in its early days, the internet was often ignored and even mocked by governments and corporations alike, with many going so far as to even dismiss it as being little more than a fad, if you can believe it. As a result of the internet not being taken quite as seriously as it should have, it was often overlooked and unregulated, but also quite free and liberating. There was no such thing as social media as we think of it today, and no company really had any sort of major monopolistic presence. It was, as its name implies, an every man for himself kind of environment, whereby rather than everyone congregating on one big site, people instead tended to have their own. Well, you did have GeoCities, but yeah, let's not go there. This resulted in some less than stellar site designs, often symbolised by an obsession with GIFs and moving text. Needless to say, back then the internet wasn't exactly good looking, but was certainly full of personality. Now, because the very idea of communicating with strangers over the internet was still quite novel, it was uncommon for people to share their real name or show their face. Instead, pretty much everyone chose to hide behind a handle to obscure their true self, as was recommended. This of course still happens today, but back then it was the absolute rule and not the exception. However, despite the anonymous hesitancy of the early net, people did still generally treat each other quite respectfully, almost as if they were talking to someone in reality. That's not to say that everyone back then was a saint, but that as the internet was still so new and fresh, it was almost universally seen as an exciting experience. And such excitement was often shared communally amongst the rare few netizens of the time, manifesting in a sort of oddly optimistic, dreamlike environment, whereby people were more real than they were in reality. A truly fascinating time. Starting around 2005, however, the internet would begin to enter its second era, that I like to call the golden era. By this point, the internet was certainly no longer being ignored, as the sheer opportunities it provided began to radically transform almost every aspect of society. The key defining difference of this era, however, was the consolidation of traffic from thousands of individual sites into a handful of massive ones. Google had defined itself as the one-stop shop of search engines, alongside YouTube for video sharing and Amazon for shopping. MySpace, though not long for this earth, was for many years a blogger's wet dream, alongside Facebook, which redefined online communication by merging one's real life into the virtual, with Twitter bridging the gap between the admirer and the admired. Now, rather than having to code or pay to get your own slice of the net, you could simply have it for free, no skill required, safe and sound, inside of these newfound generous behemoths. And for many years, it was great. Creatives thrived, businesses surged, and people were more interconnected than ever. In the year 2000, there were an estimated 361 million netizens. Just 10 years later, in 2010, this number had more than quadrupled to almost 2 billion. The excitement of this time on the internet was just like the Wild West era, but now magnified to an almost global level. Unfortunately, however, it wouldn't last, as the no-cost, low barrier to entry that these websites provided would soon be revealed to be a Trojan horse. And thus, starting around 2016, we entered the era of the internet we are currently in that I like to call the Dark Age. The previously unquestioned rise of social media would end up correlating with an equally devastating surge in mental health issues, such as anxiety, depression, and even suicide. And one-click ultra-accessible shopping would result in an equally unprecedented increase of mass mindless consumerism. But the real cherry on top was the unbelievable power that these newfound tech juggernauts now had over the world at large. Agents and executives within these companies would begin to weaponize their advanced machine learning algorithms to diminish or even outright silence those of whom they disagreed with, while at the same time artificially propping up those who towed the party line. This lack of nuance would result in the manufacturing of political echo chambers, which would unnecessarily polarize the public into a state of irrationality and disrepair. The internet, which was once seen as a bastion of freedom and interconnectivity, had ironically since transformed into a totalitarian nightmare that seemed to do more to separate people than it did unite them. Many started to believe, especially those who remembered the world before the internet, if this Pandora's box should have ever been opened at all. And it's not difficult to see why so many people have started to come to this conclusion. After all, by almost every metric, the Western world was a much happier place in 1992 than it is now in 2022, the time of recording. The people were happier, the media was better, and as the millennium slowly started to approach, there was a unique sense of optimism in the air that has since yet to be replicated. Because the current times we live in are symbolised by the complete degeneration of both social and economic stability caused by internal subversion, many people have started to look back to the 1990s with an immense sense of wanting, even amongst those who never got to experience it in the first place. What was life like back when the internet was in its genesis? Before the evils of Zuckerberg's Martian army, Bezos' cardboard box fortress, and worst of all, the final boss himself, TikTok. If only there was some sort of simulation we could use to go back in time and experience this mythical era for ourselves. This is Hypnospace Outlaw, though I'm personally going to rename this game to simply Hypnospace because that sounds way more badass. Hypnospace came out all the way back in 2019 and is a 1990s internet browser simulator. Yes, really. The game is primarily set right on the edge of the millennium in 1999 and aims to simulate what the internet was like back then. It's set in a fictional alternative universe America, which, though similar to the actual America in our timeline, differs ever so slightly in that no real names of people or companies are ever used, instead being replaced with their fictional counterparts. Microsoft, for example, becomes Merchant Soft, and President Clinton becomes President Hughes. At the start of the game, you are informed that you have been hired by Merchant Soft to become a Hypnospace enforcer, whereby you are to monitor the Hypnospace and ensure that no one is breaking the rules, such as by posting copyrighted material, illicit imagery, harassing other users, selling illegal items, or spreading malicious software. Basically, you're a Reddit mod. That's just what I've always wanted! Removed!
You can thank me later. milady?
Now, as a trusted Hypnospace enforcer, you shall of course try your best to keep the Hypnospace as orderly and above board as possible by scouting the net to check for any bad behaviour. The Hypnospace is split up into numerous different zones. Teentopia is a zone exclusively for the youth that is basically the modern day equivalent of a cringy Discord server. Good Time Valley is an ultra-Christian conservative zone that resembles the paranoia during much of the satanic panic of the time. Open-Eyed is a highly psychedelic anti-government zone that is filled to the brim with spirituality and free-minded theories. And the cafe is just Facebook without the faces. You get the idea. Each zone is filled with user pages that pretty accurately resemble the absurd designs often found during the actual Wild West internet era. They are, of course, an over-exaggeration for the sake of comedic effect, in both design and narrative style. But still, pretty bloody accurate. In fact, that's probably the biggest compliment I can give this game. The aesthetics are just, spot on. But you won't just be browsing aimlessly. Your fellow Merchantsoft employees will mail you and send you cases to specifically investigate, which upon completion will advance the story forward in some regard. The game can really be categorised as a sort of puzzler, as often the objectives you are given are nowhere near as simple to complete as they are to understand. You will often be expected to think outside the box, to find hidden pages and the like, to get the job done. Basically, if you're not someone who likes to test oneself and solve problems without much guidance, then you're not going to like this at all. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that some of the puzzles can be so outlandish that it can border on the absurd at times. But though the Hypnospace browser is the main draw of the game, it isn't all there is. In fact, the simulation even goes so far as to create an entire fictional operating system, HypnoS, that kind of resembles what would happen if you put Windows 95 and Mac OS 9 into a blender. You can install applications, including viruses, which I found out the hard way, change your desktop wallpaper, edit your screensaver, window Chrome, and man, you can even have your own virtual desktop pet. Yes indeed, here's mine, oh god, not a mouse. Fun fact for you guys, at the time of recording it's deep into winter, and because it's so cold outside, mice and other rodents tend to start invading people's houses for a combination of both food and warm shelter. Last week I was just sat in my bedroom when in the corner of my eye I saw this giant fat mouse run away at the speed of light. I've had to put a trap up, and every single time I hear the slightest bit of noise, I think it just has to be that crafty little bastard taunting me. To anyone who thinks that mice are cute or whatever the hell, think again. I mean look, even this pixelated nuisance can't resist taking a giant dump all over my desktop. Even the virtual ones are a pain in the ass. You have to go and buy food for them to keep them happy, but even when you do, they start shitting everywhere. And God forbid, if you forget to feed them for, and I am not joking here, 5 minutes, they will simply just die, and a tombstone icon will appear on your desktop just to remind you how much of a bastard you are. I mean, my God, this game doesn't piss around. And I have to say, I just absolutely adore how original of an idea this game is. The developers could have very easily just made first-person shooter number 984, but instead they decided to mix it up. I truly believe such innovative and risky ideas are only truly possible from within the indie scene, as if a AAA studio got pitched a concept like this, I guarantee they'd just instantly decline it and not even bother trying to pull it off. Or more accurately, the publisher wouldn't. It's games like these which are seemingly so niche yet absurdly creative that really tickle my fancy. And you can just tell that it was a passion project, as the sheer amount of little intricate details very swiftly reveal. For example, because the game is set in 1999, back when most people still used dial-up internet as opposed to an actual dedicated broadband box, the pages load painfully slowly. Christ, I remember being on dial-up back in the mid-2000s. I wanted to download World of Warcraft, which was around 20 gigabytes in size back then. So I left my computer on overnight to download it, only to get up the next day and see it was only on 50%. That very same download today would take just 20 minutes or so. And much like in reality, as you advance further in the game, as time starts to pass, such load times get significantly reduced. Sounds small, but it's the little things like this that add up when it comes to experiences like these, and this game has such in droves. There's a lot more I'd like to say on this game, however, as it only takes around 2 to 3 hours to complete, depending on your puzzle solving skills of course, I don't really want to comment on it too much, as I think it would spoil what little of the experience there is. And yes, if you can't tell, that is by far my biggest complaint with the game. It's shorter than the average gnome. I mean look, I get it, there's only so much you can do in such a simulation, but I feel like the game could have been at least twice as long. Just as you're about to really get into it, it just kind of stops. In fact, the game's soundtrack, which is absolutely fantastic by the way, is even longer than the actual game itself, clocking in at just under 5 hours. I would say, however, that if you're going to play this game, then make sure you do it on a PC and not a console, as I did. Being an OS simulator, it's clearly designed to be played with a keyboard and mouse first and foremost, and though you can get away with playing it using a controller, it just doesn't really feel right. Unfortunately, if you're on PC and thinking about buying the game on, say, Steam, you may be horrified to learn that it costs a whopping £15, which, needless to say, for a game that only lasts 2 to 3 hours, is simply not going to be very good value for money. Granted, the game is received by those who have played it in an overwhelmingly positive fashion, though personally, I'd wait for a big sale first, as that price is frankly ludicrous. Overall, even if it can be a bit frustrating to navigate and ends far too soon, this time travel trip is certainly an interesting ride that you should definitely experience for yourself. Especially for those of you who don't remember what the internet was like in the late 90s/early 2000s, as with this you'll be able to experience a nice simulation of what the internet was like before corporations consolidated their power and started censoring people en masse.
M'lady.